On December 7th, the China-EU summit convened in Beijing. It was the first in-person edition since 2019. How did this meeting compare to the BidenShe summit last month, and what are the prospects for China-EU relations? I'm Shannon Tiezzi, editor-in-chief at the Diplomat magazine, and to discuss China-EU relations and the summit, I'm very pleased to be joined by Theresa Fallon, who is the founder and director of the Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies, based in Brussels. Theresa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Shannon.
So let's start off with just a brief comparison. The sentiments from China and the EU after this summit. How do you compare them to the mood after the Biden-Xi summit in November?
Well, this had extremely low expectations. I've never seen such low expectations for a meeting before, and there was no effort to even try to have a joint statement to negotiate that. The EU leaders, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, and the European Council President, had a press conference afterwards. Not the Chinese, of course, counterparts did not, but there was a statement made by the Minister for Europe afterwards. So it was kind of, there were no deliverables. People are saying at least they talk to each other. The conversation is continuing, dialogue is continuing, but what's kind of bubbling on the horizon is this subsidies investigation into possible dumping on the EU market of electric vehicles coming from China. So they made the Chinese side, from what I've understood, made it quite clear they're not happy about that. Also, the Europeans use it as a chance to clarify their position, decoupling versus de-risking, and that they are doing de-risking. The Chinese side sees both in a negative light. The other issue, of course, is the perennial we can work together on climate issues. And behind closed doors, I mean, they did bring up some different issues that they hadn't broached in the past, like they could even talk about Taiwan. So that was a big change, I would say, from previous. But they tend to look at the world through an economic lens. And in just 2 years, the deficit, the trade deficit with them has doubled. So the Chinese were not happy that that was kind of focused on. They're saying already it's reducing, but I think that this is a huge problem. And also, they stressed in their press conference that they spoke for all of Europe, because we know that there are 27 EU member states. It's kind of, there are many different positions on China. They had a meeting before this to try to get everybody on the same page, but it's not too difficult to see that Hungary has a different position than, say, Germany. And even the Franco-German engine, the traditional driver of EU policy, they're really not in accord, I would say. And even the German government, the so-called stoplight government of 3 different coalition partners, is rather divided on this. So it's often the lowest common denominator of all 27 EU member states. Nevertheless, I would say that compared to last year's, which was done online, High Representative Joseph Borrell called it a dialogue of the deaf. So now they're just kind of keeping it nice and clear. But one thing I haven't seen anybody pick up on was that the Wang Lutong from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, he made kind of a dig at, in my impression, my interpretation, at the Europeans, because the Europeans constantly are asking for help from Xi Jinping, from Beijing, to use their influence on Putin in order to help conclude the war in Ukraine, to bring it to an end. And this time, yesterday, he made a statement saying, well, why can't the Europeans talk to Putin and ask him, I sense that they're getting tired of this, because it's constantly trying to ask them for help. And the Chinese clearly are supporting Russia in many ways, buying oil that we all know about, but there's also kind of Chinese weapons showing up on the field. There have been questions about ammunition. The Russians are happy to leak any of things like this to show that China has their back. For example, several months ago, the 3rd highest ranked Chinese Communist Party leader spoke at the Duma, thinking it was, just to the Duma, but the Russians leaked the video showing that the Chinese said, we will help you undermine Western sanctions. And, it's becoming more and more clear that China and Russia have strategic convergence in a lot of areas. And the Europeans, I had a chance to ask Joseph Borrell about this about 2 weeks ago. I managed to ask him a question where he spoke at an event, and he said, well, it could be worse. The Chinese could give them even more lethal weapons. So that's kind of their approach. That's why we keep asking them, because they're fearful that the Chinese could actually make things more fearful. But I think that there's an elasticity in red lines, because the Europeans, I don't know how they will respond if they actually really understand that China is supplying Russia. And we have seen the Europeans remove Chinese companies from sanctions list. They had 12 and they removed three of them, I think, if I recall correctly. And they're trying to use it as leverage to keep these companies in line. But this was also kind of highlighted in the meeting afterwards by the foreign ministry spokesperson for Europe, saying that you want our help, but then on the other hand, you want to sanction us. So they're trying to, use whatever leverage they have on the Europeans. But I think that the war in Ukraine, and having spoken to some really high-level Chinese visitors, because they've been on tours of Europe lately, I think they have a very frank view of how the Europeans, as long as the war is going on in Ukraine, they can't really make any headway with Europe. So I was really surprised that some Chinese officials were so frank about that. And, they're just going to continue. And they think after the war is over, they can possibly rebrand themselves. Maybe the Europeans will have amnesia. China will help rebuild Ukraine, so they'll get some benefits from that. But that's my overall view of the discussion so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to unpack a couple of those points separately, starting with the economic issues. As you mentioned, there was a clear sense of concern from Charles Michel and Ursula von der Leyen about the unfair, imbalanced trade relationship. They emphasized that several times in their separate comments to the press. Is there any real hope for progress on the EU side towards a level playing field, or is this just a way of explaining to China basically why the relationship is not going to progress?
I think that the Europeans are really, because they tend to look at everything through an economic lens, and they think that we are such an important market for China that they should cooperate with us. And I think that they're a bit flummoxed and confused that the Chinese aren't meeting them on this. So it's an endless mantra. They're always asking for this. The European Chamber of Commerce had the report issued this summer. They had over 1,000 issues that they were complaining about, and it doesn't make any difference. The Chinese have been promising for years to change all these things, and they just haven't happened. So they can say it. They can. I think one of the biggest concerns for Europe right now, they're one of the few regions that really don't have protectionism, and so they're fearful of China dumping on Europe. So this is a really deep concern. The US has a little more protectionism, other parts of the world. So Europe is kind of wide open for this. And I think that this is something that's deeply worrying for them. And this narrative, all right, it wasn't broached, at least from what I understand, at the summit, the comprehensive agreement on investment that was negotiated at the last days of the German European Council rotating presidency. So it was under Angela Merkel, and it happened right before Biden came into the office. But that has been in the deep freeze, and no one's even talking about it anymore. But I saw one Chinese commentator saying, well, if you want better relations, you should, use this. But I think there's no will in Europe anymore for the CAI. It's kind of missed its opportunity. It's even though it took 7 years to negotiate, I don't think anyone is willing to resuscitate that. And it's because the Chinese have sanctioned 5 members of the European Parliament, think tanks, the whole entire political security committee. So it's not going to happen. They're not going to just magically lift all these sanctions and save. There will be no face-saving way out of this. So as far as I see, there are some sweetheart deals with certain key countries and certain technologies, but apart from that, I think they can keep saying this, but we've seen China introduce a whole raft of new rules and regulations, which make it even more difficult for European companies to do business there, as well as the US companies. So I don't think it's such a great environment. Although because this meeting seemed to have like no deliverables, and in order to kind of sweeten the atmosphere, Beijing offered visas for 15 days for business folks coming over, but to only 5 EU member states. So the big economies, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Spain. So, and they asked for reciprocity so that these countries would give Chinese businessmen the same type of ability to travel to Europe, but they don't have that ability because that's under Schengen rules and they have to follow Schengen rules. So it seemed like a nice move on the Chinese part, but at the same time, it's divisive. They know about all of this, right? So they're kind of saying, we're going to give the biggest economies some special gift, but that's divisive. If they wanted to, they should have given it to all 27 EU member states, especially since this is an EU level dialogue. So I think that, it's on one hand, it looks like a gift. On the other hand, it's kind of throwing wedges or attempting to throw wedges among EU member states. So I think that that was not appreciated by the Commission, especially.
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, the official message from the EU leaders was we are united, we are unified, we're all moving in the same direction. As you also mentioned earlier, that is oversimplifying things, to put it generously. So, how united is Europe actually on China, and what will that mean for EU China policy moving ahead?
Well, we saw, for example, the head of Mercedes-Benz gave a speech recently stating, we believe in de-risking. That's why we're investing more in China. So everyone's interpretation of de-risking is rather different. So Germany has had really privileged relations. I would say the car industry, Siemens, Bosch, and BASF had really special deals and relations with China. And that was a very smart strategy because Germany's the biggest economy in Europe. It has the strongest voice on China policy. Germany also published their own China strategy this past summer, and after a lot of debate and discussion and postponement. And many have said it's rather watered down, but at least it's a start. And that kind of gave some analysts have said that kind of guided the Commission on how they should approach EU China policy. I would say that Europe is very divided on this, and some see economic opportunities. Some countries or industries are fearful of doing these types of sanction investigations or dumping investigations because they feel, for example, the car industry in China might be penalized. So there's a lot of concern and worries about actions taken in Europe, how that might affect already investments that already exist in China, because it's a very difficult time for these companies. They're still making money, less than they used to, but they already have some costs. And as we know, it's really difficult to pull money out of China these days. So they don't want to rock the boat in regard to what they already have there as sunk costs in China. So I think and then I did mention earlier, Hungary tends to be kind of a reliable partner for helping to block things from the EU that might could be useful to. Hungary is seen as kind of a useful helper to China. They tend to block or water down decisions, so that could be problematic as well. But there's a lot of horse trading going on. That's how politics are done here in Europe, and as well as, kind of between states in the United States. So we're seeing that, and it's sad to say, but it's usually tends to be the lowest common denominator of 27 EU member states, and how to fan out how to get everyone's interests represented, or you trade off on one thing and you expect to get something in another policy area. So that's the state of play right now. But I wouldn't say that it's very hard for them to speak with one voice, and it's getting harder, I think, as the economies struggle. And just going into this meeting, I should have brought this up. It has been a long farewell for the Maloney government to leave the Belt and Road Initiative, but it was announced just the day before the actual meeting. So that I thought was interesting as well, the timing of that, because they've been saying goodbye for months now. And so that's showing Italy is kind of becoming more disillusioned with what the Belt and Road Initiative had promised them, and it didn't really deliver. It's a different government than the previous government who had signed on to it. So we have different levels. Many, about 18 EU member states are already signatories to the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are other Chinese projects within Europe. For example, It was originally called the 16+1. It's a sub-regional grouping, 11 EU member states, 5 possible accession states. And even those groups have been disillusioned. It's reduced now to 14+1 because 3 members have left. And additionally, Greece was added a few years ago. So China and public opinion towards China has really declined dramatically. It was already on a downturn before COVID. COVID accelerated that, and it's continuing a downward trajectory. So I think a lot of that is because they are seen as supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine. So I think that there has been a big unpacking. And, I was just looking at some of the earlier documents. For example, with Federica Mogherini, she saw Europe and China working together kind of to try to balance the US. And that narrative has just gone with the wind. I mean, that has not really materialized. And lastly, I was on a panel in Vienna recently, and it's the first time I saw this Russian scholar since about before the war in Ukraine. I was at a conference in Moscow, and it was a really interesting conference where Russia was trying to pull Germany and China together to create a special bloc. And this was right before the war. So I thought it was quite fascinating. And I said to him on the sidelines, I hadn't seen him since this conference. And he said, well, things didn't work out with Germany so well, but Russia and China are, moving along quite well. So people see what they want to see in many respects. The Central Eastern European member states, many of them, apart from Hungary, see Russia-China cooperation. The Baltics see that as well. And we've seen not just at the EU level, even at the NATO level, China is, I think it's about 16 paragraphs in the most recent communique. So China is on Europe's radar like it has never been before.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Theresa, for that very detailed overview of China-EU relations. There's going to be a lot to continue to pay attention to in the coming months, but that's all the time we have for today. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for tuning in at home.
Thank you, Shannon.